We're into the dog days of summer, and that might mean some of you have either already visited or still plan to visit your favorite coastline this summer. So if you have even the slightest of affinities for the beach, you'll certainly want to listen closely to today's edition of Green Builder Media's Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Today, we'll take a virtual walk in the sand with Margaret Davidson of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or as it's commonly referred to, NOAA. Now, before we embark on our journey, I wanted to tell you that today's webinar would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. And those sponsors are BASF. BASF is a leader in the construction industry. With more than 600 products, serving 75 construction product categories, BASF offers the broadest portfolio of products used directly on construction sites or integrated into other products to improve the performance of construction projects. BASF is also a global leader in sustainability and corporate social responsibility, committed to constant improvements in safety, protection of health, and environmental conservation. Bio-based insulation. Bio-based insulation spray polyurethane products help to lessen the environmental impact of residential and commercial structures by sealing and insulating in one step. Bio-based insulation integrates rapidly renewable ingredients as replacement for a portion of the petroleum in many of their insulation products without hindering performance, and they've replaced chemical blowing agents with water. DuPont. DuPont puts science to work by creating sustainable solutions essential to a better, safer, healthier life for people everywhere. DuPont is focused on dynamic science that generates real-world solutions. That's why DuPont is at the forefront of building science with brands you depend on, like Tyvek, Sentry Glass, Corian Solid Surfaces, Zodiac Quartz Surfaces, and Kevlar. And the Green Builder Coalition. The Green Builder Coalition proudly announces a new membership level for just $50. For more information on this incredibly affordable resource, please visit www.greenbuildercoalition.org/join. I'm Mike Collignon, Executive Director of the Green Builder Coalition, and I'm sitting in for Ron Jones today, so I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Now, I hope that during the course of today's presentation, you'll submit questions for our guest. To do so, simply use the small box at the bottom of the Q&A. I'll review those questions and pose them to Margaret during our time together. Now, to share a little background on today's guest. Margaret Davidson has been an active participant in coastal resource management issues since 1978, when she earned her Juris Doctorate in Natural Resources Law from LSU. She later earned a master's degree in marine policy and resource economics from the University of Rhode Island. Margaret served as special counsel and assistant attorney general for the Louisiana Department of Justice and was the executive director of the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. She joined NOAA as the director of the NOAA Coastal Services Center in 1995. From 2000 to 2002, Margaret also served as the acting assistant administrator for NOAA's National Ocean Service. Almost 18 months ago, she was appointed acting director of the Office of Ocean and Coastal Resource Management. She also holds a faculty appointment at the University of Charleston and serves on the adjunct faculties of Clemson University and the University of South Carolina. Margaret, welcome to the Impact Series.
Hey, Mike, it's great to be here with you and your colleagues. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, I'm certainly excited to have you on here. I got a chance to listen to one of your presentations earlier this year, and I found it incredibly enlightening and entertaining too. So I'm really glad that you're able to share your time with our audience. And I think it's important for people to understand the connection that you and NOAA have to the building industry, because I think a lot of people think of NOAA as, oh, they're those weather people, or they deal with the oceans, they deal with climate, but you I think can explain a little bit about that connection that you have to the building industry and your interaction with them.
Sure, I'm happy to do that, and for your colleagues listening today, and thank you for taking that time, or for people listening in the future. I also have to put a disclaimer. Everything that I say is entirely my opinion. As you noted, I do use humor in my presentations. I call that the Mary Poppins principle. A spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. But I am sometimes also irreverent, especially about how the government works or not. So I always have to make it clear that my opinion is not the official opinion of my agency. So with that, let me address the first part that you raised, which is NOAA is actually a very small and relatively inexpensive agency that does a bunch of really big things. You mentioned the Weather Service. We not only monitor the weather, which I think most people do know, but we actually monitor everything in the environment around us, all the way from the floor of the deepest, darkest ocean, all the way up to the surface of the sun. So we do solar sunspots. We do a forecast for them just like we do for your local weather requirements. And increasingly, we're also developing these abilities to understand scientifically not only how the atmosphere and the oceans work, but its impact on everything within and around them, which of course does also include how do our communities remain robust, make a good living. So we support transportation, so our guys are the folks who work with the FAA on making sure that runways are aligned in the proper direction, and anyone who's ever sailed a boat certainly has used a NOAA nautical chart to avoid running aground or even to find their way home, but they're also used by the commercial maritime industry, and ports are where most of our economy flows. We're also a resource management agency. Fish in the ocean, certainly, marine mammals. We're involved in their protection, but also coral reefs, and in conjunction with our colleagues at the state level, we're involved in coastal resource management. So think coastal tourism, coastal construction, and a whole range of other economic activities. Increasingly, we're involved, particularly working with Interior on offshore wind energy issues. But I think the thing that most of your colleagues would be the most interested in is the nexus between our weather and climate data, some of the other kinds of products and tools that we make available as a result of it, and the ways in which we work with people. But I want to focus specifically, Mike, on coastal issues, although I will touch on other things more broadly. But I focus on the coast because it's a really important issue in our country and worldwide. This image is a series of satellite images from nighttime cover that are stitched together, and you can not only, of course, see where all the lights are on at night, but you can pretty clearly see certainly where all the populations are, and where the population is, so is the money. So the U.S. is not unique in having settled on the coast. In fact, most great nations have really important coastal ports because of marine transportation. It was easy to get there. There was a ready source of food, fisheries, as well as animals who came to the water. There was a great source of waste disposal and wind energy, and that became where the settlements were, and more jobs were present. So there's a reason why most of the world's great cities and the U.S. great cities are on some coastline. Because they are actually the heart of America's economy, be they big urban areas or maybe not so big areas. Like I live in Charleston, South Carolina myself. I come home to Charleston, and I live at 5.5 feet. So I want everyone to realize that when I talk about some of these issues, it's not just a professional interest, it's actually a personal interest. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, and I worked disasters for a long time, so the kinds of things I want to talk about are important. They're important to us as individuals, they're important to us as communities, and they're important to us as economies. It's many of the people, and it's most of the economic activity happening within the coastal counties, which are only about 20% of the land area. But 20% of the land area is holding almost half of the nation's economic activity. So how we keep our communities robust and active is very important to all of us. And then, because it's also an important issue, we're involved, as I mentioned, we're not only merely involved in fisheries and protected species like many of our other resource management colleagues, but we work with different levels of government as well as the private sector on issues like coastal habitats, which are good not just for critters, but we have certainly seen in the post-Sandy era some clear evidence of their impact on flood attenuation, protecting us against storm surge by absorbing wave and water energy, and they also, of course, help filter our water so that we might get back to drinking it quicker, and they perform a bunch of other critical functions for us. So you alluded at your start-in how many people run to the coast during August. Everybody loves the coast. In fact, you may not be aware, your membership may not be aware that tourism is now the single largest economic activity sector in this country, and most of that, of course, does take place on the coast. Although the Grand Canyon and Glacier are lovely parks for sure. But the other thing that's been happening more and more clearly, especially in the last decade or so, is the cost of bad weather. Tom Friedman, who's a columnist for the New York Times, wrote a few years back that the scientists had done everybody a disservice by referring to this process that was going on as global warming, because that was confusing. And if only we'd called it global weirding, everybody would have gotten that, because we've all seen weird weather, and that is true. And not only have we seen a lot more weird weather, hotter summers, colder winters, bigger snowstorms, bigger rainstorms, but we've also seen the cost of those disasters grow up exponentially. And in fact, we've broken records every continent and every category of natural disaster. Both 2011 and 2012 were record-breaking years. So the multi-billion-dollar disaster is now a way of life, not an anomaly. And I think that gets directly to the point why we're talking today, because be it coastal storms or floods, or the derecho that we saw in the mid-Atlantic, or tornadoes, or drought, or wildfire, or just the severe thunderstorms that have been prevalent for so long this last couple of months. I think that's an issue that more people are aware of. One of the other issues in an aging population, particularly on the coast, is, of course, how do we take care of people who are less able to take care of them, the sick, the elderly, the poor, the people who won't leave their houses because they got too many dogs or cats and they won't take you at the shelter. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about the other backdrop on all this, that rising sea level thing, and where that comes about, and how that trend of a slow rise, which we've been observing for several hundred years, has actually been dramatically accelerating in just the last decade or so. And then I also want to talk about risk, because where we are and how we feel about risk in our business and our personal lives is a function of a number of attributes. Where we are geographically and culturally, so what are the things that people tend to be concerned about or less concerned about where you live or in the group you align yourself with? What's your geomorphology? If I'm sitting on the rocks of Maine, I'm probably less worried about big storms coming off the ocean than if I'm sitting in Charleston, South Carolina with all of our marshes, or I'm sitting in a bowl called New Orleans. It's a function of that as well. And then, of course, then there's also a financial risk element that we always have to be thinking about. And hear that thunderstorm right outside my window today? So they talk about, Craig Fugate at FEMA talks about, it takes the whole of society to help our communities prepare for, respond quickly to, and recover quickly from natural disasters. And we take that whole of society approach very seriously at my agency. So I've listed just some of the kinds of partnerships that we have that take us to boots on the ground with our Sea Grant Extension agents, are working even with other colleagues in the Department of Commerce, like the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're the guys who worked with the private sector to develop standards for fire technology, and they're why we have fire alarms today as part of code. They've been working on wind engineering and some surge engineering issues, and I'm actually bringing them together with representatives of the private insurance and reinsurance industry, in fact, later this week, to talk about how we maybe develop an equivalent to the National Transportation Safety Board for looking at doing postmortems on disasters. And then the little acronyms on the bottom left, that's our economics, our social and economics data that's available. I'll tell you about it. It comes from census. So that's, population data. ESA is the Economic Statistics Administration, and the other one is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And all of that gets delivered through something called Digital Coast for coastal counties. Your colleagues can Google it, and they can see not only great data coming from NOAA, the Weather Service, the Climatic Data Center, the Drought Information Program, but we also, of course, have special tools for the coast. So that's another way that NOAA works with your industry and with other sectors to not only provide easier and quicker access to data and tools, but to provide subject matter expertise as well as some folks to engage on the ground. So I've been working these issues, Mike, a long time, and I was joking that being from the Gulf of Mexico, I had for the last years since Katrina listened to a lot of my enlightened colleagues talk about how come us rednecks didn't know better than to live where we lived. And I can't deny that I was slightly amused to see that the tone of the conversation had changed when New York and New Jersey, much more educated, much more important areas financially and politically, were hit. And inside D.C. as well as at the state and local levels, the conversations have been very different. So why have those conversations been different? Some for some of the reasons I've laid out, the cost of disasters, but I also want to point out a couple of examples for your community. This is a house at Montelokin, New Jersey, which is pretty clear to me from the picture was not the last house standing, but the only house really left standing. Now this guy, who was actually a retired engineer, when he built this house 20 years ago, his neighbors thought he was a little crackers for building a house with deeper and more pilings, with tie-downs all the way through the pilings up through the roof rafters and onto the roof, and with better shingles and the nails that actually turn rather than just put them in with the drill gun. You got to screw them in. They aren't nail ends. But clearly, even though the cost of his building that house was less than 10% more than all the other houses around him, he had to endure ridicule for 20 years before he was proved right. There is also the case that you know of, Mike, down in Pass Christian, Mississippi. After Katrina, this house, which is a concrete house, was also the last house left standing. Now, this guy happened to have come originally from a family that worked in the concrete business, so that was his thing, and this was a pride of passion of him to build a concrete house, even though his neighbors told him he was crazy. But and in fact, he had only built the piers and the first framing for the first floor when Katrina came through, but he hardly missed a lick on finishing the construction of his house. And he was in when nobody else was around and almost before there was really a neighborhood back. So we know how to do this, and we've seen this time and time again. We've seen it in Miami-Dade County as well. Now, for your colleagues, and I know there's some in the construction trade, as with many other walks of life, who aren't all sure about that climate thing, let me just say we don't even really have to talk about the climate thing. We just have to talk about the increase in the number and the severity of weather-related events. And this chart right before you, folks, is from Munich Re, one of the world's largest reinsurance corporation. The reinsurance guys are the guys who bail out the casualty loss guys, Allstate, State Farm, Nationwide, when they make bad bets. So they're like Lloyd's of London, whom we've all heard of, except they make more money than Lloyd's of London. Anyway, this is a chart that shows you how, at least over the last 30 years, there has been no real discernible increase, statistically significant increase in geophysical events, volcanoes, landslides, even tsunamis, although we do seem to know about them more now. And NOAA's involved in monitoring those too around the world. But there is a very clear increase in the number of weather-related events, be they hurricanes, tropicals, nor'easters, floods, drought, wildfires, or tornadoes, or just thunderbusters for days. They're increasing in frequency and they're increasing in severity. As an example, when I was growing up in Texas, in Fort Worth, I was at the bottom of Tornado Alley, the mid-plains where all the tornadoes happen. But in the last 20 years, we've seen them shift to the southeastern U.S., where we don't have cellars, but we do have trailers. And we've also seen them stay on the ground longer and be much bigger. That's why the more recent outbreaks in places like Birmingham and Moore, Alabama, Moore, Oklahoma have been so much more severe and deadly than previous tornadoes. Now, for those of you who do wonder about that climate thing, there's this place called Greenland, and it's melting at a rate not even imagined by the most catastrophic climate models from 10, 15 years ago. And it's a real problem. It's already shifted the temperature distribution of the Atlantic Ocean, which in turn is shifting the Gulf Stream. And for guys who ship stuff across the ocean, remember that part about the ports being so important to us? They've already noticed this. They're already adjusting their trade routes because it changes weather worldwide. And it does also increase the relative level of the water that's out there all the time, which in my place of Charleston, we went from having extreme high time flooding in the streets of downtown Charleston a few times a year to now several dozen times a year. And if it rises another meter, it will be more than 200 times a year. And it's amazing how tourists hate to walk through crotch-deep water for some reason. So we're taking those kinds of issues seriously wherever the Navy and the Marines have coastal facilities. They take this issue very seriously. Major ports do too, New York, New Jersey. All the big boys are already on board with people who have facilities that require that they have water access, but they also flood easily. So because it's not a matter of if, it's really a matter of when. In fact, New York City had been preparing for more flooding in their subways. That's why they actually had some giant balloons in places so they could blow up and keep water out of the subways. So, and the other issue for those in the construction trade, the issue of who pays, well, this past July, you may have noticed, Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act. It proposes some major changes. Now, how quickly they'll get enacted, for some reason now it seems people in New York and New Jersey are less adamant about the need for flood reform than they were back last summer. And they have united with some of my colleagues down on the Gulf Coast to kind of roll down the actuarial pricing of flood insurance policies on the coast. But in the meantime, for every one of you who doesn't live on the coast, thank you for subsidizing my way of life on the beautiful and scenic coast. So we know how to buy down flood risk. Flood insurance is one way. Subsidize my living here. Zoning and building codes, that's important, particularly if we actually enforce them and particularly if we update them on a regular basis. So that's really important. There are non-structural things I'll talk about, but I want to actually talk about the structural risk because I think that's what a lot of your colleagues are interested in. So the Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is a consortium of casualty loss insurers, has first with scale models and now with a full-scale wind tunnel been looking at what do we do with better methods, better materials. Can we fortify our business? Can we fortify our houses? And the answer is not only yes, and clearly yes, but we can do it for less than 5% more to build a stronger building. You know, you can build a safe room within a house for just less than $10,000. That's what the Federal Alliance for Safe Housing is about. But you can build a safer, stronger building, talk about real security, for less than 5% more. I just renovated a little house on the marsh that I'm living in, and I did some of this stuff myself. I also went a little crazy and did more than that, you know, bamboo cabinets with no VOC and recycled glass countertops, but I did go in and I retrofitted straps, both top and bottom, on my house. By the way, I used a bio product, a castor oil blown insulation product. I also put on a steel roof because it got me a break on my insurance for fire and wind, and I'm never going to have to mess with that thing again as long as I'm in that house. Now, my costs were a little bit higher than that because I did a bunch of other green stuff, not just build it stronger, but I also did other things. But I've got the lowest maintenance house, and I've got wonderfully, wickedly low utility bills. So there are materials out there. There are methods that are known. There are resources through NOAA, through the Institute for Business Home Safety, through the Green Building Coalition, and others that can help you find out more about these, and case studies, things you can go look at, as well as sources for products.
You
So
know,
visit,
Margaret, you mentioned, or you showed that slide about the IBHS's research center, and I wanted to just
yes,
add a comment on that, their research facility is pretty new. They just opened it in the last couple of years, right?
yes, yes, sir.
And they can do full-scale testing on a wide variety of construction products, from roofing to certainly wind. I think they also do hail testing there.
Yes, they do. Tim Reinhold, who is actually a CE, a wind engineering type, is their chief scientist on this project. And very accessible. He actually likes to come out and he gives good talks too, Mike.
Okay, great.
I'd be happy to introduce you to him.
No, I actually met Tim before.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah,
great.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt there. I wanted to make sure that people knew that this thing existed, because it really is quite a marvel.
Well, in fact, 20 years ago in another job, I actually hired Tim Reinhold to be a new up-and-coming wind engineering professor at Clemson, because we were working with Sun City, which was building a new development outside of Beaufort, South Carolina, and I had gone to them and said, hey, it's nice you have a gated community, but why don't you protect your people against Mother Nature? Let us work with you to put better roofs, protect the envelope, put better roofs, better doors and windows in, and see if not only does that not work for you, but that you have a happier population because they don't have to evacuate. And that was pretty much a success, and Tim's gone on to bigger successes. So I like to talk about this story. Thank you, Mike.
No problem.
So the other thing, besides more frequent and more severe events, that climate thing is happening. These are actually coastal states. So as I like to say to the young folks, this is a growth business. Wherever you are in this space, science all the way through land use planning to construction. This is a growth industry. How we build safer, smarter, more resilient. This is going to be an area of a lot of attention. There's going to be SBIR monies coming out of different parts of the government. You're going to see new standards on things that are funded by the government, construction contracts, roads contracts that are actually going to require that things be weather and climate resilient. So even if you're not there yet as a business decision, I would encourage everybody to keep their eye on it because it is coming and it is going to be where the money moves. And then because I am at a resource management agency too, I want to talk about the importance of Mother Nature's defenses as you're thinking about, particularly for those who are small to medium scale developers, you know, where and how you site is just as important as the kinds of materials and methods that you use. So one of the things we've observed all around the country after every major event, from natural disasters to oil spills, the Dutch come in and say, oh, would you like our help? We know how to do this. We've been doing this a while. And it is true. The Dutch have been doing this a while. They are the world's best engineers. Of course, they've had the whole planet as their little sandbox, too. But if we're going to take advantage of the Dutch experience, and I think we should, then the whole experience is that they use, after 2,000 years of holding back the sea with a dike, works, concrete works, and constructing a weir for the 10,000-year storm surge. Yes, the 10,000-year storm surge. They have figured out that they have to design with Mother Nature, so they're now constructing offshore berms, recreating their barrier islands and their marshes, elevating ridges, elevating houses, elevating highways, building floodgates and levees and pump stations and the whole 9 yards. And now they've even begun a process to begin moving people out of low-lying marginal areas that they're not going to protect at all. So that is the entirety of the Dutch experience over several thousand years. So I started out with what size do my water wings need to be? Reflection of we all need to learn how to swim in this challenging environment, some of us more quickly than others. And then I thought you'd be amused to know what people like me who get to talk on all these cheery topics get all excited about. So I like this little cartoon about how we drown our sorrows in a dark and stormy cocktail. And then I always close it out because even if that climate thing isn't happening, the weird stuff is happening. And a lot of people are paying attention, and this is a growth industry. And Mike, I think it's right up your alley.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly have some questions, and I welcome the audience to throw their questions out there now, too. The first one I have is, the phrase "follow the money," and you mentioned earlier Munich Re, and if anyone's tracking any kind of financial headlines or financial news, they're seeing that the insurance industry is starting to require certain development practices, whether it be in regards to flood mapping, floodplains, whether it be in regards to certain, I don't want to say building codes, but building standards, let's say, building practices. Mm-hmm. Do you see that being as big of an influence, if not bigger than any other influence out there?
I think that the conversation, hopefully inside D.C., is beginning to change, and it's in part because the big boys, the reinsurance, some of the big insurance companies, and some of the very big other financial service interests like Bank of America and J.P. Morgan Chase are paying attention. And they are increasingly concerned about their exposure and their reluctance to be more exposed. So yes, I think that while my colleagues at the U.S. Chamber will not talk about climate for policy reasons, they do, however, have developed a very robust, for instance, disaster/community resilience initiative. And I've watched at least 24 corporate foundations develop new funding portfolios in this theme area as well. So when I start seeing Fortune 500 companies and big money brokers come into this space and articulate concerns, I think it will begin to change the dimension of the debate. I know getting thousands and thousands and thousands of scientists around the world to agree on anything is monumental, but lots of people don't know that. But I do think getting lots and lots of people who move lots and lots of money around, that may even be more monumental.
And the topic of flood mapping, I kind of mentioned it in my question, and you touched on it too. We wrote a report on Delaware early this year, and their process that they were looking at for flood mapping and the debate that was involved there. They took into consideration NOAA's reports from their own state government, United Nations. They certainly heard public comment from a lot of different special interest groups.
Hmm.
Do you see um, do you see that work at the state level in more than just Delaware? Are there other states that are starting to reassess? Hey, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't be building this close, or even going as far as saying we're just simply not. We're moving it back.
So, certainly, yes. In fact, I use a tagline I got from one of those people who was involved in that effort in Delaware. I often use today's flood is tomorrow's high tide, because they were looking at what areas did they need to protect in light of rising water levels, ports, for one, ports and other important critical infrastructure, but also what areas did they need to protect through buffers and setbacks and those kinds of things. So every state on the West Coast, I believe almost all of the Great Lakes states now, certainly New England down through Maryland, have already addressed these issues related to increasing flooding and sea level rise. The state of North Carolina attempted to through a very thoughtful study. Then the legislature decided to legislate away sea level rise. So, but then they were subject to so much ridicule, they just we don't want to think about this today or tomorrow, let's push it back 5 years. And in South Florida, even though the governor is actually opposed to any of this kind of work, the 5 southernmost counties, who do have some problems, have banded together to form a Southeast Florida climate compact because, well, in South Florida, not a week goes by that somebody doesn't send me a picture of Highway A1A underwater. And anybody who's ever been to South Florida knows that A1A is kind of a key highway, not just to Key West, but everywhere, right? So people who are concerned with planning for infrastructure that's going to be designed for 30 years, and much infrastructure, at least on the East Coast, is 100 to 120 years old, are really concerned about these issues. And the Army Corps of Engineers has just released its updated sea level rise guidance as well. So you'll see this. That's why I say it's a growth industry. This will be more and more a requirement, a design requirement in federal funding opportunities, for instance. And you have to recognize that all publicly all public infrastructure is either directly or indirectly financed or subsidized or insured by Uncle Sugar. So as all that kicks in, that will have an impact on how people think about where and how they place infrastructure. And that in turn shapes where we put our commercial and residential materials.
Right, and that's a great point to add there, because that was the situation with Delaware, was they were assessing their losses on the infrastructure level and saying, wait a minute, we don't want to keep rebuilding bridges and roads and wastewater treatment plants. So we're going to do what's prudent for the taxpayer and try and figure out how to prevent rebuilding these things every so often. In turn, then that then kind of washes over, pun intended, into the commercial and residential world as well. Um, okay, so we've got evidence that sea level is rising, and that affects
Yes.
surges, that affects storm surges, that affects tides, etc.
Well, it affects tides, and it just increases the amount of just regular event flooding. So it happens more frequently and over a greater land area.
Well, and I want to throw out kind of some may consider it a silly question, but you never know. I mean, if I'm thinking about it, maybe somebody else is too. The topic of desalination.
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, ask those
So,
people in Southern California and Tampa Bay.
right. Okay, so you say, okay, we only have so much fresh water supply on the planet. Our population keeps growing. Let's desalinate. That'll get us some fresh water. Is that going to have any effect at all on sea level rise, or is just the volume just way too much? on sea level rise
Yeah.
versus desalination demands?
Yeah, well, the desalination, its problem is actually a contaminant problem. The way we desalinate, we create a lot of waste byproducts on the membranes, and then we have to do something with disposing of those membranes, which are highly salty. And it can be very expensive, though the cost is coming down. But volumetrically, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean,
Okay.
Greenland ice sheet itself alone will add 5 meters of level to the Atlantic Ocean. And I didn't even talk about the West Antarctic ice shelf. Fortunately, it'll actually have a profound impact on the Pacific Ocean, which is a much bigger basin than the Atlantic basin. But the Greenland, the West Antarctic ice shelf, they calculate that it could put as much as 7 meters into the Pacific basin. So you can see when you're talking volumetrically, our ocean 5
Right.
meters higher or 7 meters higher. That's big.
Well, and then I just want to make sure we got that covered because you get, people from all different spectrums and all different types of questions, and some people may be hesitant to ask, so I throw them out there to cover everybody.
Well, yeah, and the thing about it that's confusing for lots of people is when we talk about sea level rise, yeah, we talk about things in 50 to 100 years, because that's when look, it took us 35 years to prove that cigarettes were related to lung cancer, okay?
Right.
We haven't even been at this 35 years as climate modeling stuff, but it's gotten a lot better in the last 30. But you don't have to wait that 50 or 100 years to know we're right. All you have to do is look at the increased flooding in low-lying coastal areas, for instance, or how Florida and California used to have a wildfire season and now it's almost year-round, or how even despite the quirky weather and jet stream that we've had this late spring, early summer, still much of the Southwest is in a very deep drought, and all the signals are it's going to continue for a lot longer. So the extremes just keep getting more extreme. So you don't have to wait for 50 to 100 years to try and anticipate the fact your feet are going to get wet a lot more often right now in the next few years.
You mentioned the Greenland, and you mentioned the Antarctic ice shelf. We've seen recent headlines about the North Pole and how the North Pole is turned into a lake. That was a headline that went around.
Oh, and they're arguing about whether or not that's related to climate change or not.
Oh, sure, yeah, and
Yes, of
and
course.
I mean it's even gotten to the point where Stephen Colbert opened it with it last night.
Oh,
Um,
I'm
your
sorry, I missed it. I'll have to
South
go see
Carolina
the
native
early
there,
show. Yes,
right?
yes, he is a
Uh,
homie.
right. Now what he pointed out was, this has actually been happening since 2003. Um, and in articles that I have read, not watching his show, but articles that I've read, has talked about how it's one thing to see it in July, but the real measurement's going to be in September. That's when you got to figure out, how bad was the melt in comparison to other years. Um, what do you have any comment on just the rate of melting that we're seeing at the North Pole over the past decade?
Well, it is my understanding that it has dramatically accelerated. I'm trying to remember a chart I just saw in the last few weeks. I tend to muck here on the coast where all these people are, and not so much in the Arctic with charismatic megafauna, but important issues that affect us all. Let me say that. But I have seen the data both from NASA and from NOAA, so it's a couple of different ways that you measure this stuff, and that's actually important to know that. But yeah, not only are we having a greater rate of ice melt, but when the ice does remelt in the winter, it's slushier and more transitory than the feet of permafrost hardened ice that we used to have. So our ability to regrow ice in the winter is diminished. So that exacerbates the melt problem, which in turn exacerbates the shoreline erosion problem.
So another way to say that for us who aren't scientists is saying when you're saying the ice kind of refreezes as slush, is it technically a warmer ice?
Yes, it's a warmer, skinnier. You wouldn't want to go ice skating on it, ice.
Right. Okay. Um,
And then it's been happening every year for the last decade. Some may say that's not a trend, but a simple understanding of statistics would suggest that yes, that is actually a meaningful trend, that the rate of increase or the rate of decrease, actually the rate of increase in the melting, is itself a statistical trend and anomalous with the previous hundreds, if not thousands of years. You have to go back 18,000 BC to see these kind of melt rates.
okay.
And we that was the last little a big temperature shift happened then. I'm sure people know about that. And in the Dark Ages, when Mount Pinatubo blew, we had a shift. That was a big, different kind of shift, but it only lasted a short period of time. The shifts that we're seeing now, Mike, are shifts that are going to last until something else comes along that's even more powerful to kick them.
Okay. Okay.
Does that
Uh,
help to explain science?
yeah, and I want to keep it on ice for a minute if I could, because we have a question from Alan. He wants to know the potential sea level rise from the Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets. Did those add up across both oceans? Because you threw out the number of 5 meters in the Atlantic, 7
Well,
meters in the Pacific.
the way this works is, well, the West Antarctica ice shelf has more immediate influence on the Pacific Ocean, just like the Greenland ice sheet has more immediate influence on the Atlantic Ocean. Over time, down there in the Southern Ocean, and increasingly in the Northwest Passage, we do also have exchange of the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, but that will require equilibration. So they could be rising at different rates because there are these different sources that are happening at different rates. In time, we are one planet ocean, because you got to remember that dirt is only about 10-12% of the aerial part of the globe. So in time, it will equilibrate. But in the short run, people on the Atlantic coast need to pay attention to what's happening in Greenland, and people on the Pacific coast need to pay attention to the West Antarctic ice shelf, and the people on the West coast also need to pay attention to something unrelated to today's topic, but called ocean acidification. It's in your neighborhood already.
Now, all right, so I want to throw out something there for people who are skeptical
Okay.
about the financial side of this.
Yes.
Okay, so they could cite, well, 100 years ago we didn't have as many people, we didn't have as many buildings.
It's true.
Um, so all these financial numbers that are inflated and all these billion-dollar problems, that's just a function of our growth. It's not a function of the weather.
So I think it was, let's see, we're in 2013, so it was 4 years ago when we had the 70th anniversary of the Long Island Express, the big storm of 39 that had hit the northeast coast, a pattern somewhat similar to Sandy, though not quite. Um, and there was a guy named Roger Pilkey Jr., who actually is one of those kinds of guys. University of Colorado writes on this stuff all the time. He published a paper the year before that anniversary date, which talked about this, the changes in dollar value, property value, population density. But that if you do adjust for all those things, then if the storm of 39 were to hit again in a similar pattern, it would be closer to a $100 billion storm. Now, I don't think Sandy quite got to $100 billion, but then the numbers aren't all in either. Uh, so, yes, it is true. That's one of the reasons numbers go up. But even when you adjust, that Munich re-slide is actually adjusted for $1970. Even when you adjust, it still is going up. It's costing more. And in the U.S., it's actually crowding out other parts of the domestic budget, too. Because these emergency supplementals now are going to be traded against, public schools, public health, highways. They all come from the same part of the budget. So if we don't do something about building smarter and safer and holding down these costs, soon we're not going to have any money else other to do than to bail ourselves out. And we're seeing bailout fatigue happen too, I should mention.
Right.
So why I think there was an incentive to have a big pen approach, particularly to some types of subdivision development. What I've seen with Sun City and elsewhere, premium construction can also carry a premium tag. More people are aware of the need to have better roofs and better windows than they were even a decade ago, not just for energy purposes, but I think to protect us against Mother Nature, work with her and protect us against her.
You mentioned Sandy and now the dollars are in, and that reminds me of the movement that's happening. The speed is debatable, but the movement that's happening within New Jersey and New York State on the topic of relocation, telling people, you know what, you can't rebuild there,
Well,
or
Cuomo,
buy out.
we've done this in small things. We did this, for instance, after West Valley, New York had a problem. We did this in Greenburg, Kansas. We've done this on some small towns in the upper Red River, to be distinguished for the one I grew up with in Texas. And I thought it was pretty ballsy and smart of Cuomo to arm wrestle people and say, okay, we're going to put money on the table. And for people, we see this a lot, when people get blown out of their space, a lot of people would, in fact, actually retreat, except for that's all that they got. So we used to actually have buyout monies more readily available, both through FEMA and 20 years ago through NOAA. And I think we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to build smarter, safer, create more resilient infrastructure for sure, and be prepared to help people relocate out of harm's way when they have an inclination to do so, which is usually right after they've had their ass kicked.
Well, Margaret, I don't have any other questions. I don't see any audience questions right now, so I am going to go ahead and thank you very much for your insight and your time on what is, quite frankly, an enormous topic that probably doesn't get quite enough attention or urgency, but it has enormous ramifications, as you pointed out, not just for those people who live on the coast, but also those of us who subsidize those people on the coast.
Yes, exactly. Because it's everybody's issue right now. Until we actually do make my flood insurance rate reflect my actual exposure, people who are living safe and sound are enabling me to see so many birdies out my back window.
Well, I also wanted to take one more opportunity to thank our sponsors. Those are BASF, Bio-Based Insulation, DuPont, and the Green Builder Coalition. And I also wanted to thank the audience for joining us today. And once again, Margaret, a big thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Mike. I really appreciate it.
We hope you'll all join us next time for another edition of the Impact Series, Game Changers in Sustainability. Don't forget your sunscreen, and take care.